Samples were collected from different parts of the area, and they were analyzed. And this analysis revealed what happened when the burning sulfur reacted with the rock. Samples from the outer area of the city, which hadn't been exposed to the full intensive heat, were mainly limestone, which is calcium carbonate. And this corresponds to the building materials most commonly used in the region. But they differ from the rocks of the surrounding area, which consist of quartz and feldspar minerals. The sulfur is 98% pure, but it differs from the sulfur found elsewhere in nature. It's not in the form of crystals or iron sulfide, but in the forms of balls of compressed powder. The sulfur in the form of these balls, occurring near the Dead Sea, is only found in the world in these specific locations. The mineral samples now that were taken from the hot area in the middle of these cities, as it were, where the sulfur balls were, show that the dominating material is gypsum, which is calcium sulfate. This means, amazingly, we can explain in chemical terms what actually happened when great quantities of burning sulfur fell down on these cities that were built of limestone. Carbon dioxide is released from the limestone under intensive heat caused by the burning sulfur. At the same time, the sulfur is oxidized to sulfur dioxide, reacting with water to form sulfate, and the calcium ions then react with the sulfate ions to form calcium sulfate, gypsum. And so if limestone, in other words, is exposed to burning sulfur, gypsum is formed. Thus, the chemical analysis indicates that limestone was exposed to burning sulfur, which transformed it, to a large extent, into gypsum. Also found in the cities were rows of stones that weren't destroyed by the burning sulfur in several places, embedded in the gypsum. And they were arranged in a way as if they were like part of a foundation of a wall or a house or street paving even. The ash-like substance is therefore a mixture of limestone, dolomite and gypsum. And it contains a very high degree of sulfur as well, 5% of it, which comes from the erosion of those sulfur balls. And it's the same material in the eroded area as in the structures above. You see, that whole area was made of limestone. Some of it's eroded down, that's below the formations, and the formations, but they're all of the same material. And so sulfur must have fallen in this area in huge quantities, corresponding to at least 5% of the stone, the rock in the area. In fact, it must have been much more, because a lot of the sulfur was absorbed into becoming gypsum. And another lot would have disappeared off as gas, as sulfur dioxide. So an enormous quantity of sulfur must have fallen down. And so, in summary, from the chemical analysis of the area, we can confirm that burning sulfur indeed rained down on this place, on these specific locations. The sulfur was at such high temperature, it melted its way through the limestone, transforming it to gypsum, which is an ash-like material, before it died out due to a lack of oxygen, leaving the residual balls to us as a witness. Let's now look at the destruction of these cities. Let's look at the story starting in Genesis 18, when God appeared to Abraham, told him that he was about to judge Sodom and Gomorrah because their sin was so great. Abraham, of course, knew that Lot was there in Sodom and was very concerned that Lot was going to be destroyed. And so he humbly prayed the first prayer of intercession that's mentioned in the Bible, asking God to save the righteous from judgment. He said, "Is it right?" He says, "Would you also destroy the righteous with the wicked?" Verse 23. He was obviously mainly concerned for Lot and his family. Abraham assumed that there must be at least 10 righteous in the city through Lot's family, his daughters and their husbands and so forth, and through Lot's witness. So he said to the Lord in verse 32, "Suppose there are 10 righteous found there." And God said, "I will not destroy it for the sake of 10. And so he got God's promise that God would not destroy it if there were just 10 believers in the city. And so Abraham thought, job done. He stopped his petition. Verse 33 says, so the Lord went his way as soon as he finished speaking with Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. Abraham must have thought, you see, that he had successfully averted the destruction of Sodom and of Lot through his prayers. Little did he know that there were only 3 righteous in Sodom. Nevertheless, the Lord did hear his prayer to save the righteous, which included Lot, from this judgment. And we'll see how God answered the prayer in Genesis 19. Now, Abraham thought Lot would surely have got at least 10 people saved, even if it was just his family. He thought that God had heard his prayer. And God had, of course. But things did not work out as he thought they would. And this would have been a major test of Abraham's faith. Because the next day when he woke up, he went to have a look at Sodom to see what would have happened. And he got a shock. He saw smoke rising from Sodom. That's in Genesis 19, verse 27. He says, Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord. Then he looked towards Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the plain. And he saw, and behold, the smoke of the land which went up like the smoke of a furnace. And it came to pass when God destroyed the cities of the plain that God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had dwelt. And I want you to notice that God did answer Abraham's prayer, and that answer was the rescue of Lot and his daughters from the city. But it wouldn't have looked like that to Abraham. It was a big test of his faith. To the natural eye, you see, as he looked at that devastation of the whole region, it would have looked like Lot died in that furnace, despite his prayers. He didn't know that God had sent angels in response to his prayers and rescued Lot as a result. Well, he wouldn't have found out for some time because Lot went off to the mountains of Moab, and he wouldn't have found out that Lot was still alive. And I think Abraham got discouraged at this perplexity. And because the next chapter in Genesis 20, Abraham falls into sin, perhaps through discouragement. You know, it's always a test for us when we're following the Lord and we pray for something and it doesn't seem to happen the way we want it to, we expect it to. It seems like God's let us down. And we've got to have faith, a deep faith, that's deeper than what our eyes can see and what seems to be going on. Faith that we still trust God even if we don't understand what's going on, and so we don't blame him. And Abraham would have found out eventually God answered his prayer amazingly. And I think that helped him to have the deeper faith when he later had to offer up Isaac, and that he trusted God even though it seemed hopeless in the natural. That's the mark of a spiritual believer. Now, Genesis 19 tells the story of God's judgment of the wicked and his salvation of the righteous, because God rescued Lot. Even though he wasn't the greatest believer, yet he was a believer, he was righteous, and God saved him out of that destruction. And the story is about judgment and salvation. Genesis 19, let's read that. It says, now the 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face towards the ground, and he said, Hear now, my lords, please turn into your servant's house and spend the night, and wash your feet, that you may rise early and go on your way. And they said, No, but we will spend the night in the open square. But he insisted strongly. So they turned into him and entered his house, and then he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. The angels came to Sodom in the evening to check the place out, and Lot showed hospitality to them. Men of God were very hospitable, and this is one mark of a believer. They entered his house, and he made them a feast. You know, it's interesting that he had to do it rather than his wife. We find out really that his wife was one of those people who seemed to be a believer, but is not really. She went along with Lot, but when the crunch came, she showed her true colors and came under judgment. Well, in verse 4 it says, "Now before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both old and young, all the people from every quarter surrounded the house, and they called to Lot and said to him, 'Where are the men that came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, that we might know them carnally.'" That, of course, is talking about sexual intercourse. This reveals the depravity of the people of Sodom. They heard there's some good-looking men in town, and they wanted to gang rape them. And so that shows the kind of state the city was in. Well, verse 6, "So Lot went out to them through the doorway, shut the door behind him, and said, 'Please, my brethren, do not do so wickedly. See now, I have 2 daughters who've not known a man. Please let me bring them out to you, and you may do to them as you wish. Only do nothing to these men, since this is the reason they've come under the shadow of my roof.'" This reveals, really, how much Lot had compromised in his morality. Now, as a believer, he was different to the people of Sodom, but he had compromised in his morality, and that came through choosing to live in Sodom. He was willing to sacrifice his daughters. Lot tried to protect these men by offering his daughters instead. What would you think if your father did that to you? It's horrific, isn't it? Well, he's compromising to the spirit of Sodom. He's making political compromises for a quiet life. He was tolerating, negotiating with sin rather than resisting it. How could he sacrifice his daughter? You see, he had lost that strength of faith, the absolutes of right and wrong, and now he was a compromised believer, and to a degree he was acting like the world around him. Well, their response was very clear, verse 9. "And they said, 'Stand back, get out the way.' And then they said, 'This one came in to stay here, and he keeps,'" that's talking about Lot, "'and he keeps acting as a judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them.' In other words, we're going to rape you too, Lot." So they pressed hard against the man, Lot, and came near to break down the door. But the men of Sodom had no respect. I want you to notice that the men of Sodom had no respect for Lot, even though he'd lived among them. And they just said, "Look, we're going to do the same to you. That's what we think of you." He was compromised, you see, and they had no respect for him. He was trying to be above them, but they said, "Actually, you're really just like us." You know, you can respect someone you disagree with as long as they're consistent, but Lot wasn't. He was compromised, and he didn't have the respect of his wife or his family, and he didn't have the respect of the people of Sodom. And so when believers compromise, they think they got everything. They got the Lord and they've got the world. But actually, you can't be, they think they're going to heaven and they're also on good terms with the world, but you can either serve God first or things. And when you put the world first priority, you find out, like Lot, that the world does not respect you, and you also lose many blessings from God. Lot couldn't even bring his wife to the Lord. And when he talked to the people of Sodom, they just laughed at him. You see, we might think we're buddies with the world, but by compromising, we don't stand out from the world, we avoid criticism, but we are not respected if we're like that.